2 Corinthians chapter 6. Do not receive the grace of God in vain. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 continues Paul's discourse on the ministry and the marks of a true servant of God. Paul urges the Corinthians to receive the grace of God and embrace salvation without delay. He emphasizes the importance of conducting themselves in a manner that is worthy, even in the face of challenges. Paul contrasts the qualities that characterize his ministry with the difficult experiences that he and his fellow workers have endured. He also instructs the Corinthians to maintain holiness, warning against being unequally yoked with unbelievers, and urging them to come out from them and be separate from ungodliness. Exegesis by sections and verses. Verses 1 to 2. Receiving God's grace and salvation. Paul, as a fellow worker with God, appeals to the Corinthians not to receive the grace of God in vain. He quotes from Isaiah 49 verse 8, emphasizing the urgency of the present moment for salvation. Paul urges the Corinthians to recognize that now is the accepted time and now is the day of salvation. Verses 3 to 10. The true marks of a godly ministry. Paul describes the marks of his ministry, detailing the challenges and qualities that define his service. He emphasizes that he and his fellow workers avoid causing offenses, striving to commend themselves as ministers of God through patience, tribulations, and difficult circumstances. Paul describes a range of experiences, demonstrating their dedication to the ministry and their reliance on God's power and righteousness. Verses 11 to 13. Open hearts and restrictions. Paul addresses the Corinthians, expressing his openness toward them and his desire for reciprocation. He underscores that any restrictions are not imposed by him, but arise from the Corinthians' own affections. In response, Paul encourages them to open their hearts to him. Verses 14 to 18. Be separated from ungodliness. Paul issues a strong exhortation against being unequally yoked with unbelievers. He draws attention to the fundamental differences between righteousness and lawlessness, light and darkness, and Christ and Belile, which is a term for Satan. Paul emphasizes the Corinthians' identity as the temple of the living God, quoting Old Testament passages that highlight God's promise to dwell among his people. He calls them to be separate, not touching unclean things, and assures them that God will receive them as his own. Overall summary. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul addresses the marks of a godly ministry and proper conduct that is expected of believers. He encourages the Corinthians to embrace God's grace and salvation without delay, stressing the urgency of the present moment. Paul highlights the challenges and qualities that characterize his ministry, demonstrating his dedication and reliance on God's power. He emphasizes the importance of maintaining integrity and to avoid causing offenses. Paul also urges the Corinthians to separate themselves from ungodliness, warning against being unequally yoked with unbelievers. He affirms their identity as the temple of the living God and calls them to be distinct and separate, assuring them of God's promises.